Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a chilling chapter of history, one that we can hardly wrap our minds around. The dark tale of how raids and rivalries fueled the terrifying rise of the slave economy. Picture it: blood-soaked battlefields, kingdoms at war, and families torn apart as they were carted off into unimaginable conditions. This story isn't just about slavery itself. It's about the systems that made it so widespread, and how it became a driving force behind some of the world's most powerful empires. You probably won't survive this one, trust me. It's heavy, but we need to understand it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments too. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of how raids and rivalries fueled the slave economy begins long before the infamous transatlantic trade. The seeds of this horrifying system were planted in the lands of Africa itself, where wars, raids, and complex rivalries between kingdoms and tribes were common. You see, slavery in Africa wasn't born from just European exploitation, though of course, that played its role. It was also deeply rooted in the politics and economies of the continent. Kingdoms fought wars over resources, land, and power. The outcome? Captives, often taken from rival tribes, would be sold as slaves, either within Africa or, as the European demand for labor grew, to far-off lands across the sea. Historians still argue whether these early forms of African slavery were as brutal as the chattel slavery introduced by Europeans. But one thing is for certain: slavery, in one form or another, had been part of Africa's political and economic fabric long before the Europeans arrived. It was intertwined with conquest. Victory meant not only power, but the acquisition of human beings, who could be forced to work or traded for goods. Now, the complexity of African slavery before European involvement is often overlooked. There was a system where captives were absorbed into societies, granted certain rights, and sometimes even elevated to high statuses, depending on the culture. However, when European traders started arriving on the African coast, things shifted drastically. Suddenly, these kingdoms, many of which had long-standing rivalries, began to see the vast wealth that could be gained from selling enslaved people. Think about it for a second. A local war that would have previously left captives as mere prisoners was now a highly profitable venture. A king who could raid a rival village would not just gain control over land or resources but would also be handed a lucrative opportunity to sell these captives into slavery, feeding the ever-growing demand from Europe's burgeoning colonial economies. It was a cycle that perpetuated itself. Raids led to more captives, who were then sold to European traders, and the wealth generated from these transactions further fueled the rivalry between African kingdoms. Interestingly enough, some historians debate how much agency these African leaders had in the trade. Were they forced into participation by the overwhelming European demand, or were they complicit, driven by the potential for riches? Whatever the case, these alliances, sometimes with the Europeans themselves, intensified the inter-kingdom rivalries, leading to more raids and more captives. The demand from the Americas only increased the pressure, and soon, slaves were seen less as human beings and more as commodities, trade goods that could be exchanged for weapons, alcohol, and other luxuries. But the true cost of this system is immeasurable. Thousands, maybe millions, of men, women, and children were captured, marched through the dense African jungle, often in shackles, and then shipped across the ocean, where they would live out their lives in harsh, unimaginable conditions. Imagine being one of those captives. No possessions, no freedom, just a future of forced labor, maybe even death. Yet there's an odd sort of irony in the role these rivalries played in the development of the transatlantic slave trade. While some African leaders participated willingly, others were caught in a web they could not escape. The very rivalries that fueled the capture and selling of slaves also meant that those who resisted had to contend with growing European influence. Historians still argue whether resistance to the slave trade could have been more widespread in Africa, but the truth is that the forces of greed, power, and the temptation of wealth were too strong. The rivalry between kingdoms, once a political tool for expansion, morphed into a tool for enslavement. And the slave trade, in turn, laid the foundation for the colossal wealth of European nations, even as it broke Africa in ways that still echo today. Now that we've set the stage, let's move across the ocean to the moment when European demand for slaves exploded, forever altering the landscape of the African slave trade. As the European colonies in the Americas began to develop, there was a sudden and insatiable need for labor, particularly for the sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations that were the backbone of the colonial economy. Europeans, driven by the need to maximize profit and keep their colonial operations running, turned to Africa for cheap, disposable labor. It was a match made in hell. Historians still argue about the specific role European powers played in encouraging or exploiting African rivalries. Some believe that the Europeans were merely opportunistic, capitalizing on a system that had already existed for centuries. Others argue that European traders actively exacerbated conflicts between African kingdoms, fueling violence and encouraging more raids to meet their demands. Either way, the results were the same: an explosion of raids, kidnappings, and wars that sent thousands of Africans into bondage. As the demand for slaves grew, the competition between European nations to acquire human cargo became a ruthless game. The Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French were all engaged in a race to secure as many slaves as possible to fuel their colonial industries. The slave forts along the African coast became fortresses of wealth and violence, with European traders bartering for human beings like they were cattle. Meanwhile, African kingdoms, especially those near the coast, engaged in ruthless competition to capture as many slaves as possible, often trading with Europeans for guns and other goods. Let's take a moment to consider the perspective of the African leaders involved in the trade. Some saw it as a pragmatic business decision, an opportunity to increase their power, access better weapons, and enrich their kingdoms. They knew the European demand was constant and insatiable, and they made deals that provided them with a steady stream of goods. However, these trades were not without consequences. Interestingly, there was also a darker side to the trade. Some African kingdoms, desperate to maintain their power in the face of European encroachment, were forced into making deals with European traders, often under duress. Those who resisted were met with overwhelming force, and their people were taken by raiders allied with Europeans. The need to capture slaves became a deadly arms race. These raids, fueled by the greed of European demand, fractured societies and left families torn apart. One of the most disturbing facts about this period is the sheer scale of the human suffering. Captives were often taken in swift, brutal raids, where entire villages were wiped out in a single night. These raids were especially devastating in the central and western parts of Africa, where the majority of the slaves were captured. The human cost of the trade can't be measured. Those who survived the capture process were often left with physical scars, emotional trauma, and a life spent in servitude. Historians still argue over whether African leaders had the moral authority to resist the trade or whether their participation was purely a response to the European power structure. One thing is clear, though: the trade was fueled by the intersection of greed, violence, and power. The actions of the European traders, combined with the rivalry between African kingdoms, turned what was once a localized system of slavery into a global economy. As these complex relationships played out on the African continent, they also set the stage for the horrors of the Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. But before we get to that, it's important to understand just how crucial this supply chain was to the success of European colonial ventures. Without the steady flow of slaves from Africa, the European colonies would have struggled to survive, let alone thrive. The demand for slaves was like a freight train that couldn't be stopped. And so, the cycle continued. Raids fueled by rivalry and greed brought in captives, who were then traded for European goods, which then fueled more wars and raids. The economy of slavery became a self-perpetuating machine, one that fed off of human misery and the rivalry between nations, both within Africa and between European powers. By now, you're probably starting to get the picture. The slave economy was deeply intertwined with power struggles, both in Africa and across the Atlantic. But let's take a closer look at how slavery really took off with the advent of the transatlantic slave trade. When European demand for labor in the New World skyrocketed, everything changed. It wasn't just about Africa selling slaves. It became about the entire world, the European powers, and the American colonies feeding off each other in an insidious cycle that would last centuries. Historians still debate exactly when and how the transatlantic slave trade transformed from a relatively localized issue into a global phenomenon. Some argue that the Portuguese were the first to truly kickstart the system, using African slaves to build their colonial empires in South America and the Caribbean. Others claim that it was the British, with their vast shipping fleets, who solidified the trade into the well-organized system we recognize today. Whichever way you slice it, the demand for slaves went into overdrive as Europe's need for labor grew exponentially in the Americas. As European powers competed for land, resources, and colonies, they also competed for slave labor. In the Americas, the Spanish had already been using enslaved indigenous peoples for decades, but their population was rapidly dwindling due to disease and harsh working conditions. This left a gaping hole in the workforce that only African slaves could fill. Portuguese traders had already established a presence on the West African coast, but soon the British, Dutch, and French were also rushing to set up their own networks of slave trading posts. The demand was so high that the slave trade soon became a tightly organized system, with European traders relying on African middlemen to supply captives. These middlemen were often local African leaders who had power over smaller villages and were capable of organizing large raids. These leaders would then sell the captives to the Europeans in exchange for goods, guns, ammunition, alcohol, and textiles. The exchange of goods for slaves became a lucrative business, and over time, the selling of humans became just another commodity in a long list of items being traded. What's fascinating, though, is how this shift in power started to change the dynamics within Africa itself. As European demand increased, African kingdoms started to restructure their economies around the trade. Some kings and tribal leaders became increasingly reliant on the slave trade for their own political survival, selling captives not only from rival tribes but also from within their own communities. There was also an emerging black market for slaves, where captured people could be traded to European merchants at higher prices. But here's the thing: the rise of the transatlantic slave trade also exacerbated existing tensions between African kingdoms. While some rulers amassed wealth and power through the slave trade, others tried to resist it. Historians still debate how much choice some African leaders really had in the matter. Was the allure of wealth too strong to resist, or were some kingdoms simply cornered into participating due to European pressure and the devastation of wars they could no longer stop? To complicate matters further, African societies, like the Asante or the Dahomey, became embroiled in violent conflicts not just with each other, but with European forces. The Asante Empire, for example, was one of the largest suppliers of slaves, trading captives for firearms that were then used to subdue their enemies and strengthen their political power. These firearms came from the very Europeans who profited off of the slave trade, showing just how intertwined these forces became. Let's take a brief detour here and consider how raids affected the slaves themselves. Once a village was raided, and people were captured, they were often marched long distances to coastal trading posts where they were handed over to European slave traders. Along the way, many captives suffered from exhaustion, disease, and abuse. And yet, despite this brutality, some groups still resisted. The Maroons in the Caribbean, descendants of runaway slaves, are one example of resistance that grew out of the very same African kingdoms involved in the slave trade. These Maroon communities fought back against both European colonizers and the very systems that had once enslaved them. Back on the African continent, the slave trade continued to fuel internecine warfare. The supply of guns and ammunition to local rulers from European traders meant that small conflicts between villages could easily escalate into full-blown wars. The result was a continued spiral of violence and conflict, with no easy way out for the people of Africa. And even though slavery itself was often justified in the name of civilizing the enslaved, we now know that it was the European powers who were exploiting this cycle for their own enrichment, not the Africans who became embroiled in it. The slave trade didn't just affect the captives or the African kingdoms. It also sent shockwaves through European economies, shaping everything from the development of modern capitalism to the rise of industrialization. But the true price of this system was paid in human lives, as millions of Africans were enslaved, traded, and worked to death in brutal conditions. And, as we'll see, the repercussions didn't stop with the end of the trade. They're still felt today. Let's now shift gears and explore the far-reaching consequences that the system of slavery had on African societies, which were irreparably altered by the demand for human labor. While we've discussed the political and economic motivations behind the trade, it's crucial to examine the personal and cultural destruction it left in its wake. Entire populations were devastated, and the social fabric of countless African communities was torn apart. But there's a broader context here, one that highlights not just the loss of life, but also the destabilizing impact that slavery had on Africa's internal dynamics. Historians still argue over the scale of this impact. Some argue that the trade resulted in demographic collapse, with entire generations of men, women, and children ripped away from their homes and families. Others suggest that African societies may have been able to adjust over time, finding new ways to cope with the loss of so many of their people. But one thing is indisputable. The slave trade upended the traditional structures of African societies in ways that could never be fully repaired. Take, for example, the impact on the family unit. Traditionally, African families were tightly knit, with extended families often living together. These families had strong support networks that allowed them to survive difficult periods and contribute to the community's prosperity. But as European demand for slaves grew, entire families were taken, fathers were torn from their children, mothers from their sons, and brothers from their sisters. In some cases, families were divided into pieces, with each member being sold to different slave traders. The anguish of these separations cannot be overstated. Even the concept of kinship, which had been a central feature of African culture, was disrupted. Families were no longer complete, and entire villages were left with missing generations. The surviving members of these families often faced tremendous hardship. Communities were left to rebuild from the wreckage, but they did so with fewer resources, less manpower, and a shattered sense of unity. The effects rippled through generations, leaving scars that would endure long after the transatlantic slave trade officially ended. Beyond the immediate family, the very structure of African kingdoms and empires was altered. Leaders who had once relied on the strength and loyalty of their people were now forced to confront an ever-diminishing workforce. Some kingdoms, like the Ashanti Empire, managed to remain powerful for a while, but even they eventually succumbed to the pressures of the slave trade. The loss of so many able-bodied individuals was simply too great for these societies to endure without immense strain. While some kingdoms profited immensely from the trade, others were left to deal with the fallout. Take, for instance, the Kingdom of Dahomey. Although they became one of the most powerful slave-trading states in West Africa, their reliance on the slave trade eventually led to their downfall. As the demand for slaves increased, Dahomey engaged in brutal warfare against neighboring kingdoms, raiding villages and capturing people to sell to the Europeans. The constant violence, combined with the destabilizing effect of losing so many of their own people, weakened the kingdom and eventually led to its collapse in the late 19th century. Let's talk about a less discussed but equally significant aspect of the slave trade: the psychological toll it had on African societies. The trauma of being enslaved was not limited to those who were forcibly taken. The mere knowledge that one's family or village could be raided at any time created a sense of fear and instability that permeated every aspect of daily life. Communities lived in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that their very survival depended on their ability to protect themselves from raids. Many communities began to build fortifications, and men were trained to fight in anticipation of a European-backed attack. But despite these efforts, the raids continued, leaving communities with a sense of helplessness and despair. What's equally disturbing is the role of betrayal. As European traders made deals with African leaders, the line between ally and enemy often became blurred. Some African leaders, seeing no other option, turned on their own people, trading slaves to secure power or military support. This betrayal created deep divisions, both within communities and between neighboring kingdoms. Those who resisted the slave trade, or who tried to protect their people from being captured, were often met with violence from their fellow Africans, who saw it as an opportunity for personal gain. In a sense, African society was forced to adjust to a new economic reality. Those who were able to adapt to the changing circumstances profited from the slave trade. But for many, it was a losing battle. The brutal exploitation of Africa's resources, both human and material, continued for centuries. Even as the global abolition movement gained momentum, and slavery was outlawed in Europe and the Americas, Africa continued to bear the brunt of the legacy of the trade. But what of the people who were captured? Their story is, of course, the most tragic of all. We've heard the stories of those who survived the Middle Passage, those who arrived in the Americas to work the sugar and tobacco plantations. But what about the Africans who never made it onto the ships? What about those who died in the process, whether from disease, starvation, or violence? We must not forget that millions of people lost their lives before they ever set foot on foreign soil. Historians still debate the numbers, but estimates suggest that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and sold into slavery. And that doesn't account for those who were captured but never made it to the coast, or those who died during the long marches to slave forts. The scale of the tragedy is unfathomable. Despite the many historical records and personal accounts of those who survived, the psychological damage inflicted on Africa's people remains largely unstudied. How do you measure the collective trauma of an entire continent? It's a question that historians, sociologists, and psychologists still grapple with today. As we continue this journey, let's shift our focus to the Middle Passage, the infamous voyage across the Atlantic that enslaved Africans endured on their way to the Americas. This passage is not just an aspect of the transatlantic slave trade, it's a symbol of the unimaginable brutality and despair that defined the experience of millions of Africans. And while we can discuss the logistical details of the trade, it's important to remember that these figures represent human lives. Lives that were stolen, abused, and treated as nothing more than commodities in a horrific global system. Historians still argue over the exact number of people who died during the Middle Passage. Estimates vary, but it is believed that roughly 15 to 20% of those transported across the Atlantic died on the journey. That's millions of people, men, women, and children, lost to disease, malnutrition, abuse, and despair. And while the experience of every captive was unique, one thing was common to all: the horrors they faced from the moment they boarded those ships. Imagine being shackled in a cramped, stifling space, with no room to move, breathe, or stretch. The stench of sweat, feces, and sickness hung in the air as captives were packed together like cargo. Many suffered from dysentery, fevers, and other diseases that spread rapidly in such close quarters. Others died from the sheer psychological toll of the journey. We can never underestimate the emotional and mental anguish of being torn from your homeland, shackled in chains, and taken across a vast ocean to an uncertain future. What's even more tragic is the way the captives were treated by their captors. The crew members of these slave ships were often brutal in their treatment of the people on board. Beatings were common, and those who resisted were often subjected to the cruelest punishments. Women were often sexually assaulted by the men in charge, and the crew showed little regard for the safety or dignity of the people they transported. For many, death was a mercy. But beyond the physical and emotional suffering, the Middle Passage was also a profound cultural and spiritual trauma. The majority of those captured were ripped from their families, cultures, and traditions. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had little in common other than the fact that they were enslaved. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming despair, many of the captives held on to their humanity. Some kept their traditions alive, even in the face of violence. Others found strength in their shared experience of oppression. And despite the brutality of the voyage, many still found ways to resist. Historians debate the extent to which resistance on the Middle Passage was organized or spontaneous. Some captives rebelled against their captors, attempting to take control of the ship or escape their chains. Others engaged in more subtle forms of resistance, such as refusing to eat or attempting to drown themselves. In some instances, the crew members were so terrified of the slaves' resistance that they resorted to even more extreme measures, such as throwing captives overboard to calm the others. One of the most tragic parts of the Middle Passage is that, for many, the journey never ended. Those who survived were sold into slavery and forced to work in the brutal conditions of the Americas. But even those who survived the voyage never truly escaped the trauma they had endured. In a sense, the Middle Passage was only the beginning of the slavery they would experience. The psychological scars of the journey, combined with the dehumanizing conditions of life as a slave, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Even more tragic was the way the legacy of the Middle Passage shaped generations to come. The trauma of being torn from one's homeland, of being forced to endure such unimaginable suffering, created deep scars that would persist for centuries. African Americans, the descendants of those who survived the Middle Passage, would carry the legacy of that trauma in their cultural memory, in their families, and in their fight for freedom. What's even more devastating is the fact that this system of exploitation was not just a passing phenomenon. The Middle Passage was a key component of the economic system that fueled European colonialism. It was the engine that powered the growth of European economies, driven by the demand for cheap labor in the Americas. Without the Middle Passage, without the millions of Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas, the economies of the European powers, Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, would have been drastically altered. But despite the horrors of the Middle Passage and the suffering it caused, there is something profoundly human about the stories of survival. The captives who endured this nightmare and lived to tell their stories became the backbone of the abolitionist movement. Their voices, their testimonies, and their resilience were key to raising awareness about the horrors of the slave trade and ultimately ending it. Historians still argue about the true nature of this resistance. Some view it as a desperate act of survival, while others see it as the birth of a broader, more organized movement that eventually led to the abolition of slavery. Regardless of how you look at it, the Middle Passage represents one of the most profound injustices in human history, and the resistance that grew out of it is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Now that we've journeyed through the Middle Passage, let's talk about the brutal realities that followed for those who survived. After enduring the horrors of the voyage, the enslaved Africans were finally sold in markets throughout the Americas. But while the journey across the Atlantic was physically torturous, the conditions they faced upon arrival were no less brutal. The harsh treatment didn't end with the Middle Passage. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in a lifetime of forced labor, abuse, and dehumanization. Historians still argue about the psychological toll slavery had on those who survived. Some argue that the trauma of being torn from their homeland and then subjected to a lifetime of forced labor left deep scars that would last for generations. Others suggest that the resilience and resistance of the enslaved helped them survive and maintain a sense of cultural identity despite their oppression. But one thing is for certain: the conditions in the Americas were designed to break the spirit of the enslaved and keep them in line. Once the enslaved Africans were sold in the markets, they were subjected to a life of unrelenting toil on plantations, in mines, and in households. Their lives were marked by long hours of hard labor, grueling physical work, and constant surveillance. The constant fear of punishment loomed over them. Whipping, branding, and even execution were used as ways to maintain control over the enslaved population. And if that wasn't enough, the mental toll of living under constant threat of violence and separation from family and homeland compounded the physical suffering. What's equally shocking is how quickly the enslaved Africans were stripped of their identities. They were often given new names chosen by their owners, often from a list of European names that would strip them of their African heritage. They were forced to speak European languages, learn European customs, and abandon many of their own traditions. Some resisted these efforts at cultural erasure, finding ways to keep their customs alive, even if it was in secret. Interestingly, many enslaved Africans retained elements of their traditional religious beliefs, blending them with Christianity to create new forms of spiritual expression. These syncretic religious practices, such as Vodou in Haiti and Candomblé in Brazil, became vital sources of resistance and solidarity for the enslaved population. They not only provided a sense of community but also served as a form of spiritual resistance against the oppressive systems that sought to erase their identities. But resistance wasn't just spiritual, it was also physical. Enslaved Africans found countless ways to resist their captors, whether through acts of defiance, sabotage, or even armed revolts. One of the most famous uprisings was the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, overthrew their French masters and established the first independent Black Republic. This rebellion struck fear into the hearts of slaveholders and European colonial powers alike, showing that the enslaved were not powerless. On the other hand, there were those who resisted more subtly. They might have feigned illness, worked slowly, or stolen food to sabotage the plantation economy. This form of passive resistance was just as effective in maintaining a sense of autonomy and dignity in an otherwise dehumanizing system. While slaveholders tried to break the enslaved population physically and mentally, many Africans found ways to preserve their sense of self and their connection to their heritage. It's worth noting that many enslaved Africans also formed strong bonds with each other, creating families and communities even in the face of adversity. These relationships were vital for survival. In many ways, the strength of the African diaspora was born out of these communities. They were places of mutual support, where people could share stories, traditions, and strategies for surviving the horrors of slavery. The question of whether African Americans were able to retain their cultural identity despite the oppressive conditions of slavery is still debated. Some argue that the cultural fabric of Africa was irreparably torn apart by the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. Others claim that African Americans were able to adapt and blend their African roots with the new realities of their lives in the Americas. What's clear, though, is that the enslaved Africans in the Americas developed a unique cultural identity, one shaped by their African heritage, their experiences of slavery, and their ongoing resistance to dehumanization. By the time the abolition movement gained steam, slavery had already entrenched itself as a core pillar of the American and European economies. But while the trade in enslaved people continued to enrich the powerful, it was also a source of relentless suffering and hardship for millions of African families. And even after slavery was formally abolished in the Americas, the effects of this brutal system continued to reverberate through the generations. The social, economic, and psychological scars of slavery couldn't be erased by a stroke of a pen. Historians argue whether the abolition of slavery truly marked the end of the African American struggle, or whether the effects of centuries of oppression are still felt today. While slavery may have been officially abolished, its legacy continues to shape the lives of African Americans, from systemic racism to socioeconomic inequalities. In this sense, the story of slavery is far from over. It lives on in the struggles of today. As we transition to the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade and the official abolition of slavery in the Americas, it's crucial to understand the ripple effects that this system of oppression left behind, not just for the enslaved, but for entire societies. While the abolition of slavery might have symbolized a formal end to one chapter of human suffering, the legacy of slavery would prove to be a far more enduring and insidious force. The echoes of the slave trade would resonate through generations, shaping economic, social, and political landscapes across the Americas and Africa. Historians still argue whether abolition truly marked the end of slavery's impact, or whether it merely shifted forms. While the practice of capturing, selling, and exploiting human beings legally came to an end, the structures that supported it did not disappear overnight. In fact, in some ways, the abolition of slavery only marked the beginning of a new struggle for African Americans and former slaves. Many were left to fend for themselves in a world that had never truly seen them as equals, and the economic structures of slavery had created entrenched systems of inequality that would take centuries to dismantle. The sudden end of slavery left millions of formerly enslaved individuals with nothing. They were thrust into a society where they had no land, no money, and often no family to support them. While emancipation technically granted freedom, it did little to ensure the well-being of the newly freed African Americans. In the southern United States, for instance, sharecropping emerged as a system where freed people were essentially trapped in a cycle of debt, forced to work land that was not their own for a fraction of the profit. In many ways, the Southern economy remained deeply reliant on cheap labor, and freedmen and women found themselves working in much the same conditions as they had before, but without the legal status of slavery. This period of Reconstruction saw former slaves trying to integrate into society while still facing systemic obstacles. And while legal emancipation was a significant milestone, it wasn't a solution to the social, political, and economic discrimination that African Americans would continue to face. Even after slavery was abolished, African Americans were forced into a second-class citizenry, facing disenfranchisement, segregation, and violence from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't just the economic systems of the South that were shaped by the legacy of slavery, so too were the cultural and racial dynamics. In the aftermath of abolition, the racial hierarchy that had supported the slave economy didn't simply disappear. White Americans, particularly in the South, continued to view African Americans as inferior, and laws were created to institutionalize this belief. This led to the rise of Jim Crow laws, which maintained racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans well into the 20th century. Moreover, the cultural identity of African Americans, shaped in large part by the experiences of slavery, continued to evolve in ways that became a form of resistance. The arts, music, and religious practices that emerged from the African American experience were deeply tied to the legacy of slavery. Spirituals, blues, jazz, and gospel music became integral parts of African American culture, and these forms of artistic expression not only provided a sense of community and hope but also served as a means of resistance. Music became a way to communicate shared experiences, to cope with the trauma of the past, and to push for a future where African Americans could thrive. Historians debate how much of the African American identity that emerged in the post-slavery period was shaped by the trauma of the slave trade itself. Some argue that the resilience of the African American community is a direct result of their ancestors' survival of the Middle Passage and slavery. Others suggest that the African diaspora had already begun to evolve its own identity long before the abolition of slavery, and that this new identity was influenced by a combination of African heritage and the brutal realities of slavery in the Americas. What's clear is that the enduring legacy of slavery has affected not only African Americans, but also the broader American society. The inequalities that were baked into the system of slavery continue to manifest in racial disparities in wealth, education, and healthcare. The effects of slavery still linger in the structures of society today, often in ways that are subtle and difficult to pinpoint, but no less harmful. The conversation about race, privilege, and systemic injustice in the United States is inextricably linked to the long history of slavery and its aftermath. In Africa, the impact of the transatlantic slave trade has been equally devastating. While slavery may have officially ended with the abolition movement, the economic, political, and social damage left by the trade continues to shape the continent. The disruption caused by the loss of millions of people, particularly young men and women who were taken as slaves, had a profound effect on African societies. Many African nations, weakened by the trade, found themselves unable to protect their interests when European powers began to colonize the continent. Even after independence, many African nations continued to struggle with the legacy of the slave trade. The disruption to the social fabric and the loss of generations of people left countries without the human capital they needed to rebuild. Moreover, the exploitation of African labor didn't stop with slavery. It evolved into forms of colonial and neocolonial exploitation that continued to drain the continent's resources. Historians still debate the full impact of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa. Some believe that the lasting damage it caused has hindered the continent's development, while others argue that the colonial period was even more devastating. Either way, it's clear that the transatlantic slave trade shaped Africa's historical trajectory in ways that cannot be undone. Today, as we reflect on this history, we must confront the painful legacy of slavery and its enduring effects. We can't change the past, but we can acknowledge it and work towards a future where the scars of this injustice are healed. The struggle for racial equality and justice continues to be a crucial part of the global conversation, and understanding the history of the slave trade is a necessary step toward creating a world that is truly free from oppression. As we continue to peel back the layers of the transatlantic slave trade and its enduring legacy, it's impossible to ignore the broader implications of this system on the global economy. While the immediate effects on African societies and African Americans are undeniable, we must also consider how deeply the slave trade intertwined with the development of modern capitalism. From the factories of Europe to the plantations of the Americas, the wealth generated by slavery played a pivotal role in shaping the economic systems that continue to dominate the world today. Historians still argue about the exact role slavery played in the birth of modern capitalism. Some scholars suggest that slavery was the backbone of European industrialization, providing the raw materials necessary for the growth of industries like textiles, sugar, and tobacco. These industries relied heavily on slave labor, not only for production but also for the distribution of goods. The profits generated from the slave trade were used to fund European ventures into new industries, creating a cycle of economic growth that was built on the exploitation of African people. One of the most glaring examples of this is the sugar trade. Sugar plantations, especially in the Caribbean, were a central part of the slave economy. European traders shipped enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations, where they cultivated and processed the sugar that was then shipped back to Europe. The sugar industry was incredibly profitable, and it relied entirely on slave labor. The wealth generated by this trade not only fueled the economies of European countries like Britain, France, and Portugal but also helped fund the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, tobacco and cotton, staples of the American economy, were also produced through the labor of enslaved Africans. These crops were in high demand in Europe, and the profits they generated were vast. The plantations that grew these crops relied on a constant influx of enslaved people, which, in turn, fueled the economic engines of both Europe and the Americas. The expansion of these industries helped build the capitalist systems that continue to operate today. What's even more striking is how slavery provided the foundation for the development of the global financial system. Slave-produced commodities were traded in international markets, with the profits from these trades being reinvested into industries that were critical to the rise of capitalism. European banks, which were growing during this period, financed slave ships and plantations, further embedding slavery into the fabric of the global economy. Historians continue to debate whether modern capitalism could have developed without the foundation provided by the transatlantic slave trade. Some argue that the wealth accumulated from slavery laid the groundwork for the financial systems that would emerge in the 19th and 20th centuries. The profits generated by slavery were used to fund infrastructure projects, build banks, and create the institutions that would eventually lead to the rise of global capitalism. While the wealth generated by slavery helped fuel economic growth, it also perpetuated inequality. The profits from the trade were concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of the population, both in Europe and the Americas, remained impoverished. The enslaved Africans who produced the wealth saw none of it. They lived in squalid conditions, worked long hours in brutal environments, and were denied basic human rights. In many ways, the growth of the global economy was built on the backs of those who had nothing, a stark reminder of the inequities that shaped the development of the modern world. Even after slavery was abolished, the economic systems built on this wealth continued to have far-reaching effects. The wealth of plantation owners and European merchants didn't disappear. It was passed down through generations, solidifying the power structures that kept certain groups at the top. This wealth gap continues to persist today, with descendants of slave owners often enjoying immense privilege while descendants of enslaved people struggle with systemic poverty. Historians argue whether the legacy of slavery is still embedded in modern capitalist systems. Some scholars argue that the capitalist systems we live in today are a direct continuation of the exploitation that slavery created. The economic structures that were built on the backs of enslaved Africans continue to perpetuate inequality, even though slavery itself has been abolished. The wealth generated by slavery, and the systems it supported, laid the foundation for a global economy that still thrives on the exploitation of the marginalized. But let's step back for a moment and ask, how much of this legacy has been acknowledged? The reality is that many of the countries that profited from the transatlantic slave trade have failed to reckon with their past. While some nations, like the United Kingdom and the United States, have made efforts to acknowledge the historical role slavery played in their economies, others have been reluctant to do so. The truth is, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is still with us, and it's not just an abstract concept. It affects real people, in real ways, every single day. As we examine the ways in which the global economy was shaped by slavery, it's essential to confront this uncomfortable reality. The legacy of slavery is not just something that exists in history books, it's a living, breathing part of the systems that continue to dominate our world today. Whether it's through the continued economic inequality, the racial injustices that persist in modern society, or the lingering effects of colonialism, the scars of slavery are still visible. So, as we reflect on the transatlantic slave trade and its economic impact, it's essential to think about the future. What can we do to repair the damage caused by centuries of exploitation and inequality? How can we create a world where the descendants of enslaved people are no longer forced to bear the weight of this history, while those who profited from slavery are held accountable? These are questions that continue to haunt us, but they are questions that we must answer if we hope to truly move forward. As we move forward in our exploration of the lasting legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, we must turn our attention to the resistance movements that emerged, both during the height of the slave trade and in its aftermath. These movements, though often brutalized and crushed by the forces of oppression, were vital in the struggle for freedom and equality. Resistance took many forms, some violent, others passive, but all driven by the same desire: to reclaim dignity and humanity in the face of unimaginable suffering. Historians still argue over the significance of these resistance movements. Some view them as isolated acts of desperation, while others see them as the beginning of a broader push for liberation that would eventually reshape the world. What's clear, however, is that these movements were crucial in the fight against slavery, and they played an instrumental role in the eventual abolition of the slave trade. One of the most famous examples of resistance during the transatlantic slave trade was the Haitian Revolution. In 1791, enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, rose up against their French oppressors. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, the enslaved people of Haiti fought not only for their freedom but also for the establishment of the first independent black republic in the world. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the slave-holding world and became a symbol of resistance, showing that enslaved people could overthrow their oppressors and fight for their own liberation. This revolution wasn't just about military conquest, it was also about cultural and psychological liberation. The Haitian rebels not only fought for their freedom, but also rejected the very system of enslavement and colonialism that had dehumanized them. The Haitian Revolution remains one of the most successful slave uprisings in history and had a lasting impact on the abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas. It demonstrated that the system of slavery was not invincible, and that resistance could take many forms: armed rebellion, sabotage, and even cultural defiance. While the Haitian Revolution is perhaps the most famous example of slave resistance, it was far from the only one. Throughout the Americas, enslaved people resisted their captors in countless ways. Some ran away to form maroon communities, independent settlements of escaped slaves that were often hidden in remote regions. These maroon communities became symbols of defiance and self-determination. In places like Jamaica, Suriname, and Brazil, Maroons created thriving societies where they could live free from the threat of enslavement, and they actively fought back against attempts to recapture them. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these maroon communities. Some view them as a powerful form of resistance, while others argue that they were too small and isolated to have a lasting impact on the larger slave system. Regardless, these communities represented a form of autonomy and self-preservation that was rare in a system built on the complete subjugation of human beings. But resistance didn't just take the form of revolts and armed struggle. There were countless instances of more subtle, passive resistance, acts of defiance that were no less significant. Enslaved people engaged in slowdowns, sabotage, and theft. They might deliberately work more slowly to disrupt production or break tools to prevent the work from getting done. Others engaged in spiritual resistance, using religious practices to find solace and solidarity with one another. Many enslaved Africans found strength in their faith, creating new religious practices that blended African traditions with Christianity, creating a unique form of worship that was both a source of comfort and a form of resistance. Perhaps the most well-known example of spiritual resistance is the development of the Black Church in America. Enslaved Africans turned to Christianity, but they didn't simply accept the version of Christianity that was taught by their enslavers. Instead, they created their own religious practices that emphasized freedom, equality, and community. The Black Church became a space of spiritual and political resistance, where enslaved people could come together, pray, and discuss ways to fight for their freedom. Historians still debate the significance of the Black Church as a political force. Some argue that it was a critical institution in the fight for African American rights, while others suggest that it was primarily a place of personal salvation and not a significant political force. Regardless, it's clear that the Church played a central role in shaping the resistance to slavery, providing a foundation for the abolitionist movement and later the civil rights movement. While the resistance we've discussed here was important, it's also essential to recognize that it was not universally successful. Many slave uprisings were crushed, and many maroon communities were hunted down and destroyed. The powers that benefited from slavery, both in Europe and the Americas, were highly invested in maintaining the system. But even though these movements were often brutally repressed, they were crucial in demonstrating the resilience and strength of the enslaved people and their desire for freedom. The story of slave resistance is also the story of the abolition movement. Over time, these acts of defiance and rebellion began to spread, and the resistance became more organized. Abolitionist leaders, both black and white, began to speak out against the horrors of slavery. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison became prominent voices in the fight to end the slave trade. They were inspired by the resistance they saw and heard about from enslaved people, and they worked tirelessly to bring about change. While the struggle for abolition was long and hard-fought, it ultimately succeeded in the 19th century. The abolition of slavery in the United States and the British Empire, among other countries, marked a monumental victory for human rights. But even after the abolition of slavery, the struggle for freedom and equality continued. The legacy of slavery, with its deep scars of inequality and injustice, remained a constant reminder of the work still to be done. Historians still debate how much of the modern civil rights struggle can be traced back to the resistance movements of the past. Some argue that the abolition movement laid the groundwork for future fights for equality, while others point out that the systemic racism and discrimination that followed slavery continued to marginalize African Americans long after slavery ended. What's clear, though, is that the resistance to slavery was the beginning of a much larger movement, a movement that would continue for generations and remains ongoing today. As we now shift to the aftermath of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and the continued struggle for equality, we must address the long-lasting psychological and cultural impacts of slavery, impacts that have persisted even into the present day. While the formal abolition of slavery in the 19th century may have marked a turning point in legal terms, the emotional, societal, and cultural scars left by centuries of oppression have not faded easily. The psychological trauma that was inflicted on generations of African slaves did not simply end with emancipation, but continued to shape the lives of their descendants. Historians still debate the extent to which the trauma of slavery affected those who survived it and their descendants. Some believe that the emotional and psychological scars of slavery were so deep that they continue to affect African American communities to this day. Others argue that, despite the horrors of slavery, African Americans were able to build strong communities, identities, and cultures that provided them with resilience in the face of continued oppression. Regardless, there is no doubt that the legacy of slavery left deep emotional wounds that would take generations to heal. Let's start by exploring the concept of intergenerational trauma. The children of enslaved people, even though they were born free, inherited the emotional weight of their parents' experiences. The trauma wasn't just personal, it was collective. The anguish of separation from family, the experience of physical violence, and the constant threat of death or punishment shaped the very ways that African American families functioned. These emotional scars were passed down through generations, affecting the way people viewed themselves, their families, and their futures. But even more disturbing was the effect that slavery had on the African American sense of identity. During slavery, Africans were stripped of their names, cultures, languages, and traditions. They were dehumanized to such an extent that they were seen as nothing more than property. The psychological effect of being treated as subhuman for centuries is hard to overstate. For many, it led to a profound sense of worthlessness and a loss of cultural pride. The trauma of being treated like an object, a tool for labor, carried through the generations, and the struggle to reclaim a sense of identity became a crucial part of the African American experience. The end of slavery didn't immediately solve this crisis of identity. Although African Americans were legally free, the social and cultural implications of being treated as inferior for so long were much harder to overcome. The legacy of slavery left many African Americans feeling disconnected from their African heritage, with little understanding of their ancestral roots. Over time, African Americans began to rebuild their cultural identity through music, art, literature, and religion, but the process of healing was slow and fraught with obstacles. They had to fight not only against systemic racism and discrimination but also against the deep internalized damage caused by centuries of enslavement. Historians also argue about how much the abolition of slavery actually changed the economic conditions for African Americans. While they were no longer legally bound to a master, the economic realities that freed slaves faced were just as brutal as slavery itself. Sharecropping, tenant farming, and discriminatory labor practices left many former slaves trapped in a cycle of poverty and debt. They were often relegated to the lowest-paying jobs, with few opportunities for advancement. Even those who managed to gain some level of economic independence were constantly faced with the specter of racial violence and intimidation. The end of slavery didn't magically erase centuries of economic exploitation. In many ways, the systemic racism that continued to marginalize African Americans was simply slavery's new face. From the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation to the widespread practice of denying African Americans the right to vote or own property, the social and economic structures that supported slavery remained firmly in place. The legacy of slavery persisted in the form of segregation, disenfranchisement, and the institutionalized racism that continued to impact African Americans' daily lives. And yet, despite the immense challenges, African Americans began to rebuild. They created schools, churches, businesses, and organizations that allowed them to develop a sense of autonomy and pride. The civil rights movement of the 20th century was, in many ways, the culmination of this long struggle for recognition, equality, and justice. Figures like W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and later, Martin Luther King Jr., became champions of African American rights, pushing for social and political change. But even as these movements made significant strides, the legacy of slavery remained a persistent force in American society. Today, the question of how to fully reconcile the legacy of slavery is still up for debate. Many believe that reparations, financial or otherwise, are necessary to address the historical wrongs committed against African Americans. Others argue that the true solution lies in addressing the root causes of systemic inequality, such as racial discrimination in education, employment, and criminal justice. But whatever the solution may be, it is clear that the consequences of slavery, both psychological and social, continue to affect African American communities today. The emotional and psychological toll of slavery, and its lingering effects on African American identity, are not just historical footnotes. They continue to shape the culture, the politics, and the social realities of African Americans. From the persistent disparities in wealth and education to the continued fight for racial equality, the legacy of slavery is alive and well, even though the formal institution of slavery has long been abolished. Historians argue whether it's possible to ever truly heal from such a profound and sustained period of suffering. Some believe that healing can only come through a complete and honest reckoning with the past, while others feel that healing must come from within the African American community itself. What's undeniable is that the legacy of slavery continues to affect the African American experience in ways that are both visible and invisible. It's a reminder that the fight for equality and justice is ongoing, and that history, no matter how painful, cannot be ignored. As we continue to examine the aftermath of slavery, we must turn our attention to the modern-day implications of the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. While slavery itself was abolished over a century ago, the reverberations of this inhumane system continue to influence global politics, economics, and social dynamics. The effects of the transatlantic slave trade are still visible today, from the structural inequality that persists in the United States to the long-term consequences in Africa. Historians still argue about the extent to which slavery has shaped the modern world. Some believe that the global economy is still heavily influenced by the wealth accumulated through the exploitation of enslaved Africans, while others argue that the economic systems of today have evolved beyond this history. However, what remains undeniable is the fact that the legacy of slavery has left deep scars on societies across the world. The enduring economic inequality and social discrimination faced by people of African descent are a direct result of the centuries of exploitation that began with the transatlantic slave trade. In the United States, the legacy of slavery is evident in the persistence of systemic racism, which continues to shape the experiences of African Americans today. Despite the legal abolition of slavery, the economic and social systems that were built on the exploitation of African Americans have remained in place. The segregation and discrimination that followed the Civil War, particularly through Jim Crow laws, created a system of racial inequality that persists in many ways today. From educational disparities to healthcare access and criminal justice, the effects of slavery can still be seen in the barriers African Americans face. Historians continue to debate the best way to address these disparities. Some argue that the solution lies in reparations, financial compensation for the descendants of enslaved people, as a way to correct the historical injustices. Others believe that reparations are insufficient, and that more significant, systemic changes must be made to address the root causes of inequality. What's clear is that the legacy of slavery cannot be fully reconciled without addressing the ongoing inequalities that continue to affect African Americans. In Africa, the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade are just as profound. While many African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, the long-term effects of slavery and colonialism have left them struggling to overcome economic and political instability. The loss of millions of people, particularly young men and women, during the slave trade disrupted African societies in ways that continue to hinder their development. In many cases, African nations were left without the human capital needed to rebuild after the trade ended, and the loss of so many people in the prime of their lives has had lasting demographic effects. The legacy of the slave trade also exacerbated the effects of colonialism, as European powers, having profited from the slave trade, continued to exploit African resources through colonization. Many African nations found themselves in a similar position to what they had faced during the slave trade, stripped of resources, forced into subservience, and unable to break free from the global systems of exploitation. Even as African nations continue to fight for economic independence and stability, they are still grappling with the effects of slavery and colonialism. The scars left by centuries of exploitation are evident in the social, political, and economic challenges that many African nations face today. The struggle to overcome these historical injustices is ongoing, and it's clear that the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade still looms large over the continent. Meanwhile, the African diaspora, particularly in the Americas, has built resilient communities in the face of overwhelming adversity. From the civil rights movement in the United States to the ongoing fight for racial justice, the descendants of enslaved people have been at the forefront of movements for social, political, and economic equality. These communities continue to build upon the resistance of their ancestors, creating art, culture, and social movements that challenge the enduring legacies of slavery. One of the most powerful ways that the legacy of slavery is addressed is through the arts. African American literature, music, dance, and visual arts have all played pivotal roles in expressing the experiences of those impacted by the transatlantic slave trade. From the poetry of Langston Hughes and the novels of Toni Morrison to the music of Nina Simone and Kendrick Lamar, the arts have provided a platform for African Americans to share their stories and challenge the ongoing legacy of oppression. Through these cultural expressions, African Americans have not only preserved their history but have also challenged the narratives imposed by slavery and racism. The art of resistance has become a vital tool for healing, for educating future generations, and for pushing back against the systems that continue to oppress them. As we consider the lasting legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, we must also recognize the global movement toward racial justice that has gained momentum in recent years. From the Black Lives Matter movement to global protests against systemic racism, there has been a renewed focus on addressing the deep-rooted inequality that still affects people of African descent. These movements have brought the history of slavery into the public consciousness, pushing for greater recognition of the injustices that have been inflicted and calling for action to address the ongoing consequences. The fight for racial justice, however, is far from over. Historians, activists, and everyday citizens continue to demand change and seek ways to heal the wounds left by slavery. The challenges are immense, but so is the potential for change. By acknowledging the true history of slavery and its lasting impacts, we can begin to create a future where the descendants of enslaved people are no longer burdened by the injustices of the past. The work is difficult, but it is essential, because the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a historical footnote. It is a living, breathing force that continues to shape our world today. Now that we've traced the ripple effects of the transatlantic slave trade into modern times, we need to delve into the political landscape that emerged as a result of slavery. The foundations of modern political systems, especially in the Americas, were deeply influenced by the institution of slavery, and its impact continues to shape the way societies function today. The exploitation of enslaved Africans not only transformed the economies of Europe and the Americas but also had a profound effect on the development of political systems, from the birth of nations to the creation of laws that institutionalized inequality. Historians still argue over the exact role that slavery played in the formation of modern political ideologies. Some believe that the existence of slavery in the United States, for example, helped shape the country's foundational political concepts, including the ideas of freedom, liberty, and equality. Yet, paradoxically, these very ideals were built on a system that denied freedom and equality to millions of people. The contradictions embedded in the founding documents of the United States, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, are a direct result of the reliance on slavery as an economic system. For instance, the phrase, "all men are created equal," was written by men who owned slaves, and this contradiction has been a point of contention throughout American history. The decision to classify enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in Congress highlights the fundamental inequalities at the heart of the American political system. While the Founding Fathers espoused ideals of liberty and justice, they simultaneously upheld a system that brutalized and dehumanized millions of African people. But the influence of slavery didn't stop with the American Revolution. It also shaped the political trajectory of many newly independent nations in the Americas. After the abolition of slavery in the United States, many Latin American countries followed suit, yet the legacy of slavery was deeply embedded in their political structures. Even in nations that abolished slavery relatively early, like Mexico and Brazil, the racial hierarchies established by the slave trade continued to affect political power dynamics, with former enslaved people and their descendants often excluded from full participation in society. In the United States, the political implications of slavery were most sharply felt during the Civil War. The country was divided, not just geographically but ideologically, between the North, which was largely opposed to slavery, and the South, which depended on it for economic and political power. The war was not only a fight over the institution of slavery, but also over the nature of the American political system. Was the nation founded on principles of equality, or was it built on an economic system that relied on the exploitation of an entire race of people? The abolition of slavery did not resolve these political tensions, it only shifted them. The Reconstruction era, following the Civil War, was meant to integrate formerly enslaved people into American society as equals, but political resistance to this effort was fierce. The end of slavery didn't mean the end of white supremacy or racial segregation. Instead, it laid the groundwork for a new kind of political battle, one fought over the rights of African Americans to vote, to be educated, and to live as equal citizens. Historians still debate how successful Reconstruction was in addressing the political and social consequences of slavery. While it did lead to significant political advancements for African Americans, such as the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, it also sparked a backlash that culminated in the rise of Jim Crow laws in the South. These laws, which institutionalized racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans, were a direct consequence of the political and economic power that had been built on slavery. Even after slavery was abolished, the political structures that maintained white supremacy remained largely intact. The political landscape of the United States today is still shaped by the legacy of slavery. The civil rights struggles of the 20th century were, in many ways, a continuation of the battles fought during Reconstruction. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which aimed to eliminate barriers to voting for African Americans, was a direct response to the political disenfranchisement that began during the post-Civil War era. While the civil rights movement made great strides in securing political rights for African Americans, many of the issues that were rooted in slavery, like racial inequality, poverty, and systemic discrimination, remain deeply entrenched in the political system. This legacy of slavery also continues to impact the way race is politicized today. The debate over reparations, for example, centers around the idea of addressing the long-lasting effects of slavery. Should the descendants of enslaved people receive financial compensation for the trauma, exploitation, and disenfranchisement their ancestors endured? The political fight over reparations is part of a larger conversation about justice, recognition, and accountability for the crimes committed during the transatlantic slave trade. Internationally, the political legacy of slavery is also deeply felt in former colonial nations. In Africa, the effects of both the slave trade and European colonization continue to influence political relations and structures. The borders drawn by European powers during the colonial era, often without regard for ethnic or cultural divisions, have contributed to ongoing conflicts in many African nations. The legacy of colonialism and the slave trade is still present in the political instability, economic underdevelopment, and social inequality that plague many African countries today. In the Caribbean and Latin America, the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to face political and economic marginalization. Despite the formal abolition of slavery, the legacy of racial hierarchies persists in the political and social systems. African descendants in the Caribbean, for example, still struggle with the legacy of slavery in terms of access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. The political struggles of these regions are intertwined with the historical legacy of the slave trade and the political systems that were built upon it. Historians, sociologists, and political theorists continue to debate the best way to address the legacy of slavery. Should we focus on reparations? Or is a more systemic approach, aimed at addressing the political, economic, and social inequalities that persist today, the better solution? Whatever the path forward, it is clear that the political legacy of slavery is one of the most significant challenges facing both the United States and the world. Until we fully address the ways in which slavery shaped the political systems of the past and continues to shape the present, we cannot fully move forward. As we look deeper into the lasting effects of the transatlantic slave trade, it's important to recognize the ongoing struggle for identity and cultural preservation in the African diaspora. The forced displacement of millions of Africans during the slave trade left an indelible mark on their descendants, an enduring battle to reclaim and preserve their cultural heritage. Though many of the enslaved were robbed of their native identities, their cultural spirit did not fade away entirely. Instead, it adapted and evolved in ways that created unique diasporic identities, blending African traditions with the realities of their new, often brutal environments. Historians still debate whether the enslaved Africans were able to maintain their cultural identity or if, over time, they lost their connection to their African roots. Some scholars argue that African traditions were so deeply rooted in the cultures of the enslaved that they were impossible to erase, while others believe that the experiences of slavery led to the creation of an entirely new, hybrid identity. Regardless of where one falls on this spectrum, there's no denying that African Americans, as well as other diasporic groups, have struggled to balance their African heritage with the imposed European and colonial systems they were forced to live under. In the Americas, the creation of new forms of culture and identity was often a response to the dehumanizing effects of slavery. As enslaved Africans were forcibly removed from their homeland, they brought with them customs, beliefs, and languages that would eventually blend with those of the indigenous peoples and European colonizers. This cultural fusion gave rise to unique art forms, spiritual practices, and social structures. Music, dance, religion, and oral traditions became the foundation of African diasporic identity, offering both resistance to the oppressive forces and a means of survival in a hostile environment. In places like the Caribbean and Brazil, African traditions became crucial components of the local culture. Religious syncretism, where African spiritual beliefs were combined with Catholicism, is one example of how enslaved Africans maintained their connection to their heritage. In Haiti, Vodou emerged as a powerful religious and cultural expression that resisted French colonialism and the system of slavery. In Brazil, Candomblé and other Afro-Brazilian religious traditions allowed enslaved Africans to preserve their cultural practices and form communities of solidarity and resistance. In the United States, the legacy of slavery shaped African American culture in profound ways. Music became one of the most important expressions of African American identity. Spirituals, blues, jazz, gospel, and hip-hop all emerged as forms of resistance and self-expression that told the stories of African American struggle, resilience, and hopes. These musical genres are not only reflections of the African American experience, but are also critical parts of global culture. The rhythmic patterns, improvisational styles, and call-and-response traditions that originated with enslaved Africans continue to influence contemporary music today. However, the struggle to preserve cultural identity has not been without its challenges. The imposition of European language and customs, along with the systematic erasure of African traditions, created a disconnection between African Americans and their African ancestry. For generations, African Americans were forced to adopt English as their primary language, while their native tongues were suppressed or lost altogether. African American names, which had often been linked to African heritage, were replaced with European-sounding names that reinforced the racial hierarchy of slavery. Despite these challenges, African Americans have worked tirelessly to reclaim their heritage. The Harlem Renaissance, for example, was a cultural movement that celebrated African American art, literature, and music, and it was an important step in reclaiming African identity. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and W.B. Du Bois helped reshape how African Americans saw themselves and how they were seen by the broader American society. This cultural renaissance laid the groundwork for future movements, like the Civil Rights Movement, by highlighting the richness and complexity of African American culture. Today, African Americans continue to engage in the process of cultural reclamation and preservation. The study of African ancestry, through genealogy and DNA testing, has become a growing trend as people seek to reconnect with their African roots. The creation of African American museums and the celebration of African American history through events like Black History Month are efforts to ensure that the contributions of African Americans to global culture are acknowledged and celebrated. At the same time, the African diaspora around the world is increasingly embracing Pan-Africanism, a movement that seeks to unite people of African descent across the globe in recognition of their shared history and culture. However, the struggle to preserve cultural identity is not just a matter of personal connection, it's also deeply political. The continued marginalization of African American culture and identity is a direct result of the historical injustices that were born out of slavery. Systemic racism continues to oppress African Americans, undermining their sense of self and their ability to thrive. The ongoing fight for civil rights and social justice is not only about legal equality, but also about recognizing and valuing African American identity and culture. Historians and sociologists still argue over the best way to reconcile the cultural legacy of slavery with the realities of modern society. Some advocate for reparations, seeing it as a way to redress the cultural and economic wrongs that were done to African Americans. Others argue that a cultural renaissance, one focused on education, representation, and the celebration of African American history, will be the key to healing and empowerment. But what's undeniable is that the cultural and emotional impact of slavery has been passed down through generations, and it continues to shape the African American experience. As we reflect on this legacy, it's clear that the journey of reclaiming identity and culture is far from over. African Americans, and other descendants of enslaved Africans, continue to fight for recognition, justice, and cultural autonomy. And while the road ahead is long, the resilience of African American culture serves as a testament to the strength and spirit of those who survived the horrors of the slave trade and the enduring struggles that followed. As we continue to reflect on the profound impact of the transatlantic slave trade and its legacy, it's crucial to address the economic inequalities that continue to result from centuries of exploitation. While slavery itself may have been officially abolished, the economic structures built on the backs of enslaved Africans have not simply disappeared. Instead, these systems have evolved into more subtle, yet deeply entrenched forms of economic inequality that still affect African Americans and other descendants of enslaved people today. Historians and economists still debate the extent to which slavery influenced the modern economic systems of the United States and other countries involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Some argue that the wealth generated by the slave economy is directly linked to the economic dominance of Western powers today, especially in the United States. Others suggest that the end of slavery marked the beginning of new forms of economic exploitation, particularly through systems like sharecropping, tenant farming, and the racialized labor market that continued to marginalize African Americans. One of the most striking examples of how slavery shaped modern economic inequality is the wealth gap between African Americans and white Americans. The cumulative wealth of African Americans has been dramatically impacted by the history of slavery, segregation, and institutionalized racism. During slavery, enslaved people created immense wealth for their owners, but they were denied any ownership or wealth accumulation of their own. Even after emancipation, former slaves were often left with nothing, no land, no savings, no property, while their white counterparts, many of whom were slave owners, retained their wealth and land. In the post-slavery era, this economic disparity only worsened. The inability of formerly enslaved people to accumulate wealth, combined with the systemic discrimination that limited their access to education, employment, and property ownership, meant that African Americans started life with an immense economic disadvantage. This gap continues to widen today, as the wealth of white Americans continues to grow, while the wealth of African Americans remains significantly lower. The historical practice of redlining, for example, which began in the 1930s, prevented African Americans from owning homes in many neighborhoods, keeping them locked out of the wealth-building opportunities that homeownership provided. These discriminatory practices created generational poverty in African American communities, making it much harder for descendants of enslaved people to accumulate wealth or build financial security. Even though redlining was outlawed in the mid-20th century, its effects are still felt today, as many African American communities continue to face disinvestment and economic hardship. In addition to redlining, the racial wealth gap is exacerbated by disparities in education, employment, and healthcare. African American families are less likely to have access to quality education, which limits their opportunities for higher-paying jobs. Historically, African Americans have been steered into lower-paying, manual labor jobs, which keeps them from accumulating wealth at the same rate as white families. This, in turn, creates a cycle of poverty that is difficult to break. Meanwhile, African Americans often face higher levels of unemployment and underemployment, which further deepens the economic divide. In the healthcare sector, African Americans also experience poorer health outcomes, which are directly linked to both the historical legacy of slavery and the systemic discrimination that continues today. The lack of access to quality healthcare and the persistent inequalities in health outcomes contribute to the economic challenges faced by African American families. Medical debt and the inability to access affordable care only add to the financial burdens, making it harder for African Americans to achieve financial stability. Historians argue whether these systemic economic disparities are the direct result of slavery or whether they are more a product of 20th century racial discrimination and exclusionary policies. Regardless of the cause, it's clear that the economic systems of the past continue to shape the present, with African Americans still experiencing the consequences of centuries of exploitation. As we examine the modern-day effects of this economic legacy, we must also consider the calls for reparations, financial compensation for the descendants of enslaved Africans, as a means of addressing the economic disparities created by slavery. The idea of reparations is still hotly debated, with opponents arguing that it would be too difficult to implement, and that it would create further divisions in society. However, proponents of reparations argue that they are a necessary step toward rectifying the historical wrongs committed during slavery and its aftermath. Reparations, they argue, would provide financial restitution to African Americans who have been economically disadvantaged by the legacy of slavery. While the question of reparations remains unresolved, many argue that addressing the racial wealth gap and the economic inequalities that still persist is essential for achieving racial justice. Whether through reparations, policies that promote economic equity, or broader social reforms, the goal is clear: to dismantle the systems of inequality that were built on the foundations of slavery and to create a more just and equitable society for all. The fight for economic equality is a continuation of the struggle that began during slavery. Enslaved Africans, though denied any wealth or ownership, created immense economic value through their labor, but that value was never returned to them. The fight for reparations and economic justice is a way of correcting this historical injustice, ensuring that the wealth generated by the exploitation of African labor is redistributed in a way that helps build the future rather than perpetuating inequality. As we reflect on this, it becomes evident that slavery's impact on the global economy, and specifically on the economic inequality that exists today, cannot be ignored. The legacy of slavery is not just a matter of history, it's a matter of the present and the future. In order to create a fairer, more just world, we must confront the economic disparities that have been inherited from slavery and work toward policies that ensure economic justice for all. As we move forward, it's essential to recognize that the fight for racial and economic justice is not only about undoing the damage of the past, it's also about reshaping the future. The legacy of slavery doesn't simply reside in the disparities that we see today. It also lives in the narratives and ideologies that continue to perpetuate racial inequality. The dehumanization of enslaved Africans was not just a product of physical violence, but also of ideas about race, worth, and power that still shape our societies. One of the most pervasive ideas that emerged from slavery was the notion of racial superiority, the belief that white people were inherently superior to people of African descent. This belief was not only used to justify the exploitation of African labor but also to create a racial hierarchy that placed white people at the top and black people at the bottom. It's these ideas, more than the physical institution of slavery, that continue to impact the lives of African Americans and other people of African descent today. Historians still debate the roots and evolution of these racial ideologies. Some argue that the concept of race as we understand it today was largely constructed during the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery needed a justification, and one of the ways to rationalize the brutal treatment of enslaved Africans was to dehumanize them, portraying them as subhuman. By doing so, it became easier to justify their enslavement, exploitation, and degradation. The idea of race became entrenched not only in law but in social and cultural norms. The division between black and white became rigid and institutionalized, influencing everything from legal systems to education, healthcare, and housing. Even after the abolition of slavery, these racial divisions continued to shape the social, political, and economic structures of both the United States and other former slave-holding nations. This racial divide continues to inform the experiences of African Americans today. The disparities in wealth, education, health, and opportunity are the direct result of the systems of inequality that were established during the era of slavery. And the cultural ideologies that reinforce those systems, the belief in racial hierarchies, still persist in the form of implicit biases, stereotypes, and systemic discrimination. Historians argue whether the racial ideologies that were born during the period of slavery have evolved over time, or whether they are simply more deeply ingrained. Some scholars suggest that these ideas have evolved into more subtle forms of racism, manifesting in things like colorblind policies that ignore race or in economic systems that disproportionately disadvantage people of color. Others argue that the persistence of these ideologies is a direct reflection of how little has changed in terms of racial justice. Either way, the struggle to dismantle these ideologies and systems is ongoing. A crucial part of this struggle is the work of activists, scholars, and community leaders who continue to push for racial equity. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and the Black Lives Matter movement of today have been instrumental in challenging the cultural and political ideologies that were built on the foundations of slavery. They continue to raise awareness about racial injustice and push for systemic change, aiming to eradicate the deeply ingrained racial hierarchies that still exist in our society. In addition to these movements, there has been a growing effort to decolonize education and history. For too long, the history of slavery and its legacy has been taught in ways that minimize or ignore the full extent of its impact. Educators and activists are now pushing for a more inclusive and accurate portrayal of history, one that recognizes the contributions of enslaved Africans and acknowledges the ongoing impact of slavery on the African diaspora. These efforts to reclaim history and reshape the narrative are crucial for moving forward. By confronting the legacy of slavery head-on, we can begin to dismantle the myths and ideologies that have justified racial inequality for centuries. This process of truth-telling and healing is essential for building a more just and equitable future. But there's another side to this battle, one that involves empowering the African American community to reclaim and celebrate its cultural heritage. For generations, African Americans have fought to maintain their sense of identity in the face of oppression. From the Harlem Renaissance to the rise of African American cultural icons in the 20th and 21st centuries, African Americans have created spaces for cultural expression that celebrate their history, resilience, and identity. Today, the African American community continues to lead the way in cultural innovation. The arts, music, literature, and film created by African Americans have become not only a source of pride for the community, but also a vital contribution to global culture. The impact of African American artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers can be seen in everything from jazz and hip-hop to the works of contemporary authors and filmmakers who address issues of race, identity, and social justice. However, this celebration of African American culture is not without its challenges. Despite the undeniable contributions of African Americans to global culture, the struggle for recognition and equality continues. From the representation of African Americans in mainstream media to the ongoing fight for justice in the legal and political arenas, there are still many barriers to break down. But the resilience and creativity of African Americans serve as a beacon of hope, a reminder that the fight for freedom and equality is not just about addressing past wrongs but also about building a future where the voices of African Americans are heard, respected, and celebrated. Historians argue whether the cultural achievements of African Americans can ever fully heal the wounds of slavery. But one thing is certain: cultural reclamation is a powerful tool in the fight for racial justice. By embracing their heritage and celebrating their culture, African Americans are not only honoring the legacy of their ancestors but also forging a path toward a more just and equitable future for generations to come. As we conclude our journey through the history and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, it is crucial to take a step back and look at the enduring consequences of slavery, not just in the present-day struggles of African Americans, but in the broader context of how societies around the world have grappled with the impact of this dark chapter in human history. Slavery may have been abolished centuries ago, but the scars it left behind have been passed down through generations, affecting not only those directly descended from the enslaved but also the entire fabric of global society. Historians still debate the ultimate effects of the slave trade. Some argue that the global economic systems we see today, with their roots in colonialism and exploitation, are still heavily influenced by the wealth created through the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Others suggest that the modern world has, to an extent, moved beyond the direct legacy of slavery, and that the focus should now be on finding ways to address the inequality that persists due to its aftermath. Either way, the transatlantic slave trade continues to be a central part of how we understand the current state of racial and economic inequality, not just in the Americas, but globally. One of the most important aspects of understanding this legacy is recognizing the global nature of the impact of slavery. While the transatlantic slave trade is often discussed within the context of the Americas and Europe, its effects reverberated throughout Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and even Asia. The resources and wealth generated by slavery played a central role in the development of Western capitalist economies, which, in turn, shaped the rise of global trade, colonialism, and industrialization. The trade itself was not only an economic machine but also a political one. It formed the foundation for the racial ideologies that shaped national identities, legal structures, and even cultural norms. In the United States, for instance, slavery and the subsequent racial segregation were embedded in the very legal framework of the nation. The U.S. Constitution, despite its lofty proclamations of equality, counted enslaved people as only 3/5 of a person, and the Dred Scott decision in 1857 affirmed that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States. The global impact of these ideologies cannot be overstated. The racial divisions that emerged from slavery were not contained to the United States. They became a blueprint for systems of exploitation and segregation in many countries. The idea that people could be seen as inferior or subhuman based on the color of their skin spread across Europe and the Americas, fostering a system of institutionalized racism that lasted for centuries and continues to be felt today. However, even as the effects of slavery continue to be seen in modern inequality, there is hope for change. Social justice movements, from the civil rights movement in the United States to the African independence movements in the 20th century, have been critical in challenging these legacies. The ongoing fight for racial equality is deeply rooted in the struggles of those who resisted and fought against slavery, from the abolitionists of the 19th century to the Black Lives Matter movement today. Yet there's no denying that there is still much work to be done. While legal victories like the Civil Rights Act and the end of apartheid in South Africa represent significant progress, the social, economic, and political systems that were built on slavery remain deeply entrenched. The wealth gap between African Americans and white Americans, the disparities in healthcare, education, and criminal justice, and the continued prevalence of systemic racism in many societies show us just how far we still have to go. A critical part of this process involves not only acknowledging the history of slavery, but also confronting the present-day manifestations of its legacy. This means addressing the social and economic inequality that continues to disproportionately affect people of African descent. It means holding accountable the institutions that perpetuate racial injustice, from law enforcement to education systems, and working to dismantle the structures that allow racism to flourish. The conversation about reparations is one avenue through which we can begin to right the wrongs of the past. The question of reparations, whether in the form of financial compensation, land restitution, or other measures, has become increasingly prominent in the public discourse. While the debate continues, it is an essential part of the conversation about justice and equality. Reparations are not just about financial compensation. They are about acknowledging the lasting harm done by slavery and taking tangible steps to address the ongoing inequalities it has caused. As we look forward, it's important to remember that the fight for racial equality and justice is not just about the past. It's about building a future where the legacy of slavery is no longer a barrier to opportunity and freedom. It's about creating a world where the descendants of enslaved people are no longer marginalized, but instead are able to thrive in a society that values them and their contributions. And perhaps most importantly, it's about ensuring that future generations are taught the truth about this dark chapter in history, so that we can break the cycle of oppression and build a world that is more just, more equitable, and more inclusive. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade will never fully fade. The echoes of this brutal chapter in history will continue to reverberate through our societies for generations to come. But as long as we remember the past and continue to fight for justice, there is hope that we can create a future where the scars of slavery no longer define us. Now, as we bring our journey to a close, take a moment to reflect on the tremendous resilience, strength, and spirit that has carried us through centuries of oppression. The story of slavery is not just a story of suffering, it is a story of survival, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for freedom. It is a story that we must continue to tell, not only for those who lived through it, but for those who continue to fight for justice today.